So my name is Bill Riley. I work at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, which is one of the DOE national labs, and I'm participating on the NG Arctic Modeling Project and have since the beginning. A little bit about me. I have been doing land modeling for many, many years. I was the co-chair for the Land Model Working Group at NCAR for a while until just recently, and now I'm part of the DOE Earth System Model Group, the ACME group, and I work on the land model there. I'm one of the co-leads there. Okay, so that's enough about me, and I can answer more questions later. Let me talk a little bit about the NG Arctic modeling effort. This is a project that started ballpark 5 years ago. I may not be exactly right on that, but 5 or 6 years ago. It's managed by Stan Wolschlager at Oak Ridge. He's the PI, and we have both observational and modeling people on the project that span several of the national labs, Oak Ridge, here at Berkeley, Brookhaven, Los Alamos, and university partners. The chief scientist, Vladimir Romanovsky, is at University of Alaska at Fairbanks. And as I go through the discussion of some of the progress we've made on modeling, I want to make the point that we've really been striving to make sure that the observations and the experiments and the models are working in a cycle so that the observations inform the models and vice versa. And Stan has been very good at encouraging that to happen. And as you know, that doesn't always happen in these types of projects. So there's been some success there, and we call that the MODEX approach. Our overall goal over the past years has been to learn from the observations, either that we make or others make, and develop process-rich ecosystem models. So these are intended to be mechanistic models that we can apply to evaluate the observations that we made at the site scale. Our goal is to look at how Arctic ecosystems are going to change over time under a changing climate. And more than just building process or mechanistic models, we want to be able to take what we learn and put them into an Earth system model. And we're working in the ACME land model to do that. And I'll give you some examples of how that's going. So here's those points that we do have this large focus on observations, that we are working to do benchmarking, and I'll bring up, Abhishek brought up the ILAM. So the ILAM is a benchmarking project that I'll describe a little bit that I'm participating on with being led by Forrest Hoffman at Oak Ridge. Okay, so in phase 1, which we are now out of, so the project is in its second phase, 3-year phase. We started phase 1 at Barrow, and I'll show you some figures from that and some modeling results in a second. We have since moved some of the effort to the Seward Peninsula. So now we have sites on the Seward Peninsula. At the same time, some of the work at Barrow is ongoing. And we chose that because these are two very different systems, both interesting for the observationalists and experimentalists, but also for our modeling work. So let me just really briefly give you some pictures of the sites. This is a picture of the BEO, and it's a coastal plain site, relatively very low relief, and characterized by these thaw lakes, as well as a lot of polygonal tundra, and a lot of carbon. And so we're interested in understanding the dynamics there. Also, let's see, with respect to, so with respect to the people that are actually out there doing the observations, there's infrastructure, which is nice, places to stay while you're in the field. The second set of sites, which have just been spinning up now, although there's work already coming into the data archive and models being set up, are on the Seward Peninsula. So we have sites along the Teller, Cougarock, and Council roads. These sites are really different than the polygonal tundra sites because there's actual relief. There are things that look like watersheds. There's topography. There's differences in permafrost conditions from continuous to discontinuous permafrost, and a diversity of plants that are really interesting for us when we're thinking about vegetation cover changes over time. So in this second phase, we have 5 questions, and we have people working in observations and modeling for each of these questions. And as you'll see, a lot of them overlap, but the basic idea is we're interested in how the landscape structure and organization is currently exists and how it will change, things like thermokarsting and so forth. We're really interested in, of course, the carbon budgets associated with permafrost. One of the interesting things for the models is this idea of trait-based models, and so we're interested both in plant traits and microbial traits. what drives them and what could change over time and how would that affect carbon budgets. I'll show you some modeling results in a second from the fourth question, which is that we're looking at how dynamic vegetation will affect the carbon budgets and also the surface energy budgets, hydrology and so forth, and the thermal budgets in the soils. And then this is all wrapped into the fact that we know the hydrology in these high latitude systems are going to change. They'll change because of changing precipitation, but then there's also all these changes to geomorphological and topographical features, which are going to change the moisture that microbes and plants experience. So as I said, we have several years of work already under our belt, and we have a bunch of different models being used. And we apply them largely, we've been thinking of this, applying it at different scales with the goal of doing this scaling exercise, which Abhishek mentioned is hard, and I'll come to that in a second. So at the site level, and this is now both at the Barrow and the Seward Peninsula sites, we're applying three models that are three-dimensional. They're essentially three-dimensional reactive transport models with some forms of biogeochemistry and plant representations of them. That's the ATS, which is the Arctic Terrestrial Simulator, PFLOTran, and EcoSys. And then at the site scale, we also apply the Acme land model. We also are doing watershed scales. And by this, I mean we're doing three-dimensional coupled simulations at larger scales. You can think of what, characteristic watershed scales for the Seward Peninsula and uncharacteristic watershed scales for the polygonal tundra. But nevertheless, we try to do some sort of larger scale, fully coupled three-dimensional simulations. And then we also are running the Acme land model, and previously we were running CLM, but since the DOE has now moved into the Acme, the model we're running with the Acme land model and this model called EcoSys. There are a lot of results from the project, so unfortunately I won't be able to review them all, so I thought I would just pick a few from each of these scales and then talk about scaling between them, some of the things we've done and some of the things we're thinking about. So I'll talk about scaling, and then I'll mention at the end some benchmarking efforts, which sounds like it overlaps with or similar to what is being done in above. Okay, so the first example I want to show is at the site level, what is being done with this Arctic Terrestrial Simulator. So this model and the other three-dimensional models we use are models that can be run at very fine scales. So 10 centimeters, 20 centimeter grid cell resolutions. And the ATS has been developed specifically to look at high latitude systems. So it represents phase changes in the soil, all of the hydrological and thermal dynamics that we think are important on the surface water flows, ponding, and then snow cover, including snow redistribution and the effects of vegetation. And there are several papers out there now. I just thought I would show you one that Ethan Kuhn is working on. He's at Oak Ridge and sent me this. So this is an example where this is on one of the sites in the Seward Peninsula where we have these ERT measurements, which is the top right figure there, showing, so these are measurements that can probe into the surface and give some estimate of where ice is, for example, in this case. And what you can see, or let me just assert, there's a strong relationship between the permafrost conditions, the thaw depth, and the vegetation cover. And so Ethan is using this model, this three-dimensional model, ATS, to look at a hypothesis which is out there in the literature, but has not been thoroughly analyzed with a model like this, of how shrub or vegetation cover interactions with snow can affect thaw depths over time. So that's the type of study that can be done with this model. The second fine scale model we're using is EcoSys, and EcoSys is also a three-dimensional model. One of the advantages of it is that it, in addition to doing the thermal hydrology, also lets us look at the biogeochemistry in the soil with explicit representations of microbes that are important for nutrient cycling and carbon cycling, as well as detailed representation of vegetation. So it allows us to look at things like radiation competition between PFTs, which we think is going to be important over the next decades. This sort of indecipherable diagram here on the right is just intended to give you the sense that it's a mechanistic, complex model, but it's been applied to dozens of sites and a bunch of sites at high latitudes, and tested, and it does well. And we're doing the same thing at our NG Arctic sites. So let me just give you a quick example of that. So we applied the model, and this is, EcoSys was developed by Robert Grant at the University of Alberta, and Robert came to Berkeley and did a sabbatical here, and so he's collaborating with the team now to set this up. So we're really interested in the fine scale relationships or dynamics in the polygonal tundra. And with a model like this, we can look at it. So we set it up for 3 of the primary landscape types: low-centered, flat-centered, and high-centered polygons. We have a bunch of measurements of thermal properties, saturation, vegetation, and so forth. And we tested the model pretty thoroughly. This is just an example with data from Vladimir's group on thaw depth. This is the picture of ice content in the model versus where the measurements were measuring the ice. And we had excellent predictions across these different landforms. And not surprisingly, what we found is that at this scale, it really is important, the differences in the microtopographical features. So if you're in a trough and it's wet, that makes a difference for your carbon cycling. It makes a difference for the vegetation that grows there. But interestingly, if you have a believable model at each of these types of landforms, and then you scale them up to the landscape scale where there are multiple polygons of each of these types, then we can get very good estimates of the eddy. These are eddy covariance measurements for the CO2 flux, which has a much larger footprint. And so that's at least a starting point, perhaps, to do this type of scaling. And so that leads me into this second point, that this idea of spatial scaling is still, I mean, it is an unsolved problem across all of the terrestrial systems. Nobody, in my opinion, has actually come up with a way to do this coherently across all the scales we're interested in and our interest in large-scale predictions through our system models. So this project, we've been exploring several approaches. I'll just quickly give you a couple of examples. One is to try to just parameterize the ESM scale models, which might be 25 kilometers or something, so pretty coarse resolution compared to the underlying heterogeneity from fine resolution simulations. So there's some work going on in that. There's also work using the ATS, which I'll show in a second, of attempting to couple fine resolution models to an intermediate scale, which you might think of as a landscape scale, and then finally up to an ESM resolution model. And so this is a figure that Scott Painter at Oak Ridge sent me, highlighting some work in a couple of their recent papers. And what they've been able to show, this is with the ATS, which is this 3-dimensional model, is that if you simulate the details of the polygons of different types, and then you abstract that to a single column model, you can capture much of the variability in the below ground processes and in the surface water processes. And so the argument goes, if you can do that, then you can assemble multiple polygons into this bottom figure of a landscape of these polygons and evaluate at least whether or not you're capturing these hydrological and thermodynamics. And they've shown in this recent paper that it is a viable way to go between fine scale modeling and this landscape scale. So that's encouraging, and it's also consistent with the results I showed you a second ago with EcoSys for the biogeochemistry. And then the other thing we've been working on is reduced order modeling. So this is the idea that you take, in our case, what we're doing is taking a single model, which was pFlowTran, which is also another 3-dimensional reactive transport solver that's set up for these systems, running it at high resolution and at coarse resolution, and building, we use principal orthogonal decomposition, but there are other approaches to train the model to capture the high resolution details only with the coarse resolution model. And then you can take that training and run it forward with the coarse resolution model. And that's been very effective at doing and getting at some of these fine scale features without having to actually simulate them directly. So let me give you an example at the next scale. So as I mentioned, we're very interested in the vegetation cover change that is almost certainly going to happen at high latitudes. And there's a bunch of publications out there now. We wanted to apply the model EcoSys because we want to be able to look at the several different factors that could affect this, including the light environment, competition for light, the subsurface biogeochemical environment that's going to change certainly with warming, and have that be coherently represented. And so these are 25-kilometer resolution simulations that we take. We go from 1900 out to 2100. And then we evaluate in the contemporary period where we have observations, we evaluate how well the model is doing. So we found very good comparisons with Modus NDVI and with this FluxNet MTE GPP product, which is a machine learning product that's been trained to FluxNet data. Now, of course, there aren't very many eddy covariance sites to do the training in the Arctic, but nevertheless, we at least match it well for whatever that's worth. So what we find, not surprisingly, and this is just a one-slide synthesis of these two papers, but what we find is that over the 21st century, we expect very large changes in net primary production, not surprising because there's enhanced CO2 and warming, and also very large changes in heterotrophic respiration because there's a lot of warming. And, but the balance between those two is that the system will remain a sink, and you can see this is the figure just showing the change in net ecosystem production. Just so you can see the geographical distribution across the North American tundra, that it's the increased are of course larger where it's warmer in the southern part of the tundra, and then get less so as you go north. The interesting thing, and I don't know, at least to me, one of the interesting things was that this was caused by a strong change in the relative dominance of the PFTs. So in this model, we have deciduous and separate deciduous and greenleaf, deciduous and needle-leaf shrubs, sedges, lichens, and moss, all competing in a grid cell. And what you can see in this figure is that there's a dramatic shrubification of the tundra over time, much more woody system at the end of the 21st century. Which in itself, I mean, so that explains why we think the system will become, will be able to hold so much more carbon than before. So I also mentioned that part of the goal of the project, of the NG Arctic project, is to bring our process level understanding that we develop at these fine scale models and through the observations into an ESM model. And we're using this ALM model. And there are a couple of versions of that model. This is the one that's using what we're calling the equilibrium chemistry approximation to resolve the nutrient competition in the soil. There's a little figure of it. And I'll just give you one example because I think it's kind of interesting. If you, in the literature, and this is a good example of a disconnect between observationalists and modelers. In the literature, there are now decades of data suggesting that plants remain active into the winter, especially with respect to nutrient uptake. And none of the Earth system models consider that at all. So they are, one way or another, incorrectly calculating the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus that can be taken up by these systems after senescence. So the model that's developed here, which is based on work at NG Arctic and also work we're doing in the ACME project, is a trait-based model. And so the nutrient competition in the soil is mechanistically represented based on the rooting traits and the microbial traits. And therefore, you just emerge this pattern of uptake over the winter. And so the model captures that. And the interesting result, which I'll not spend much time on, is just that in the model, we are getting somewhere, up to 50% of the uptake of plants at high latitudes for nitrogen is coming outside of the growing season. And that has very large implications for nitrogen losses and basically how we conceptualize these systems. In the current Earth system models, they're very leaky, but in reality, they probably are not. And this may be an example explanation of why they are not. Okay, and then I wanted, because this is IARPIC and I understand that you're interested in collaborations, we also had a collaboration just recently with the NASA CARV and the BGC Climate SFA, which is a scientific focus area under ReNew's program, where we used the model so we have a methane model that we have in ACME, and that has been worked on for the NG Arctic project. Oops, oh, sorry. What happened? There we go. And we compared the site level observations with the model. So this is just the site level observations we could find in Alaska, and actually one in Sweden, including the one at the NG Arctic site. And then we worked with Chip Miller and Steve Wofsy to take the CARV data, run it through the atmospheric inversions, though this is the Whorf-Stilt model, and then compare it to our bottom-up estimates from the methane model. And the R-squared is not embarrassing. There's problems, and we found that we actually learned something about the seasonality of the emissions that were wrong in the model, likely wrong, from these types of comparisons. And so that was actually quite a successful collaboration. And then Qian Xu was a postdoc here, and this paper came out just last year. Okay, and I have 5 seconds left on my 20 minutes, so let me just end by saying one of the, as I mentioned, we're really interested in coupling observations and models. One of the ways to do that is with this ILAM package, and this is being developed in that SFA I mentioned, led by Forrest Hoffman at Oak Ridge. The original goal of the ILAM package was large scale, so CMIP scale model comparisons with as many observations as we could put together. Excuse me. More recently, we're trying to develop this package for subregions and bringing in different types of observations. So you can imagine things like experimental perturbations or very limited region observations. It could be very helpful for the modelers to know how their system is working. So it's just a little eye candy for us to advertise that we're doing that now in this project. Okay, and I'll just end there with a summary that the goal of the project, of NG Arctic's modeling project, was really to work closely with the observationalists and the experimentalists to make a process level model that we could then integrate through a coherence scaling strategy, TBD, up to an ESM model, and we're working in Acme to do that. I was really excited by this recent I said cross-agency, but I meant interagency collaboration with the NASA group for the CARB observations, and perhaps there are other ways we can find collaborations for that. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is I only mentioned a few of the projects, but the project itself has been really productive. And so I extracted this from our recent annual report that Stan put together. These are just the modeling papers. So if you're interested in any particular thing that the project is working on, this is one way to get at that. So that's it. I'm happy to answer questions.